Welcome to my channel. This is Socialist Links. In this video, we're going to talk about Israel and the current situation between Israel and the fight against the Palestinian minorities and the Palestinian people within Israel. That Israel has continually made an ongoing Nakba against the Palestinian people, and using the existence of Hamas and the actions of Hamas as well to justify a lot of the attacks that they had committed against the rights, the human freedoms, and the very livelihood and humanity of Palestinians and in their own land. Here, I'm going to talk a lot about the Zionist response to Israel's attacks against Palestine, as well as the fact, even statements from the Israeli state itself. A very common argument that Zionists would usually make is that Hamas is a very terrorist organization, which means that entirely with a lot of these fights and with a lot of these efforts to continually fight Hamas is indeed a necessary evil in order to stop a terrorist organization from killing civilians within Gaza. Now, this is indeed true that Hamas is indeed a terrorist organization and has committed attacks within Jerusalem and Israel in the past before the attacks of the Gaza Strip recently, and is indeed known to essentially commit into terrorist actions within the Gaza Strip itself, which is why a lot of the people a part of Gaza really don't even support Hamas that much, really at all. It does not then justify the use and the entire brutality of in the name of counterterrorism to be used against civilians and against children and women in hospitals, schools, workplaces, and various other necessity and formatted infrastructure projects and social services to be able to help the people of Gaza and to be able to help the people of the Gaza Strip. Another common claim that the Israeli state themselves basically talk about is the use of underground tunnels from Hamas in these civilian areas. Now, despite the fact of this claim, a lot of this entire claim is very much untrue. In fact, this claim has been used by Israel for the past 20 years, when they actually started getting a lot more advanced weapons and getting a lot more advanced technology to use against Palestinians within Gaza and in the West Bank, that they can claim that there are terrorist organizations that have underground tunnels to where the killing of civilians is really just an indirect consequence of fighting against Hamas. This has actually been debunked, though. In fact, there has been videos, there has been photos, and there has even been investigations of buildings to where the past infrastructure and past demolition of buildings where it was hit, there has been no records of underground buildings actually being detected, but rather a suspicion of underground tunnels and actually hideouts of Hamas and terrorist organizations and hiding out into these civilian areas without actually confirming nor actually having any form of evacuation order towards the civilians to where they can get out peacefully and not be killed as well. This claim has even been used so much by the Israeli state that independent architects had to actually go down to the Gaza Strip and into the West Bank in claims of underground tunnels being used by terrorist organizations such as Hamas and the PFLP, that is now considered a terrorist organization by the Israeli state since 2018, I believe, or since the start of it, actually. Either way, this has essentially been a format that has been used by these two orgs, that architects had essentially try to go actually into the West Bank and into Gaza to try and actually confirm this in an independent source, rather than actually propaganda from the Israeli state or Zionist organizations that support Israel. And they have even found that there are little to no results of underground tunnels actually being used by terrorist organizations, but rather actually missiles and bombs and guns and various other weapons and supplies to Hamas and the PFLP has actually been used within deserts and within hard terrain areas to where they can actually get their supplies and actually get their areas and be able to not be attacked by missiles due to the consequences of attacking such sites that will result into earthquakes, avalanches, and to other formats that would devastate civilian areas nearby. Basically, they're not incorrect into saying that Hamas is using civilians as body armor, and as like human shields, and meat shields to make a lot of their trading and a lot of their supplying underground. However, it's not done through underground tunnels. It's done through the desert and through rocky terrain. And that is essentially what has been found within independent architects in 2019. Again, even assuming that these entire claims were true and that these claims were indeed accurate, they aren't. But assuming that they were, as I mentioned before, there still was no evacuation plan, nor was there any effort to have an evacuation for civilians without alerting the terrorists before launching the bombs. Again, even then, when these bombs and a lot of these missile attacks within Gaza is essentially an effort where civilian social services and areas and formats and needed necessities for people there have been destroyed and have been crushed down by the Israeli state. You can say the ends justify the means, but the thing is, the means have to correlate with the ends. And even then, the ends are not even worth it entirely as well. And the means into doing so is not even correlated with the ends due to the fact of the substitution over the people over the actual people that live in Gaza. Meanwhile, where Jerusalem and the Zionists that support Israel are living in lavishly and are being able to profit and be able to benefit from the killing of the Palestinian minority. Not to mention that Hamas and the PFLP have actually really very little actual representation and actual say within the entire Palestinian National Liberation Movement. In fact, the majority of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement is unaffiliated to any organization and really spontaneously organized from youth groups and students within the West Bank and in Gaza to protest against the Israeli state and be armed in defense against the police and against the military that Israel has committed against the arrests of journalists, the arrests of students, and the arrests of political activists within its country. In fact, it is even statistically proven that usually 60% of the entire Palestinian National Liberation Movement in total is actually spontaneously organized. Thus, it's not very accurate, nor is it actually real, to argue that Hamas or the PFLP or even the DFLP, I think that's what they're called, actually represents a large majority of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, and that the Palestinian National Liberation Movement are Islamic fundamentalists. They are not. A lot of them are usually unaffiliated to politics, but just want self-determination of Palestine. Most are indeed communists, but are unaffiliated communists due to past formats and past actions of quote-unquote communist organizations that have substituted over the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in the past, and a lack of an actual Marxist and Leninist organization that actually talks with the working class and actually has its leadership be workers themselves, talking with other workers and educating workers, and rather these organizations trying to substitute over the workers in revolution. And then there are very few that are liberals that actually want a two-state solution among Palestine and Israel as well, but are more essentially sympathetic to Palestine than Israel. There are others that are essentially Islamic Democrats that essentially want Islamic values within Palestine, but essentially democratic formats. These people are usually very, very small within the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews that actually claim that the existence of Israel is an illegitimate format according to the Testaments and according to the biblical notes and the biblical text of Judaism that essentially says that Israel cannot be mocked, nor can essentially cannot be mocked because because of it being forbidden according to Abraham, the prophet that founded Judaism, or is the prophet that essentially is worshipped by Jews. And then there are the PFLP, the Maoists, and Stalinists within the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And then there are the Hamas, which is the Zionist fundamentalists. Again, majority of actually the Palestinian movement are usually communists or are not affiliated with any organization within Palestine. Now, to my fellow leftists, am I promoting then pure spontaneity, that then the Palestinian people have to make a revolution just in their spontaneous formats without actually making an effort? Well, no. In fact, in my previous video called Israel a Fascist State, I've actually promoted an actual effort to support the National Liberation Movement and to actually format a united front in order to build the vanguard party within Palestine. However, what I mean in this spontaneous movement is that not necessarily that we have to essentially substitute over the working class, but have to talk within the workers themselves. The actual teachings that Vladimir Lenin had actually talked about within his theory of vanguardism that he took away from Karl Marx himself. Now let's talk about the arrest of journalists, the burning of farms, and the arrest of activists that is very much underreported. The media and the entire establishment of the media, too, capitalist propaganda, has essentially underreported actually arrests of public officials, of media outlets, and as well as activists and journalists, and as well as political theorists and political activists within Palestine in order to suppress and disorganize the entire movement of the Palestinian National Liberation. And a lot of the attacks that are coming about within the West Bank and not in Gaza is very much being underreported, due to the fact that the West Bank does not necessarily even have an official government. Even the government that is attributed to be the government of Palestine is usually not even supported or is not usually considered as a real government within Palestine. The West Bank is basically a stateless territory that is self-organized by the people themselves in their own farms and collectively organized entirely from them. Is this a worker state? No. However, this is an autonomous zone that is not necessarily have an affiliated format, nor is there actually an effort of a worker state, and there is still actually a standing army within it, as well as the fact that there is indeed a Congress that is substituted over a lot of activists, but activists don't really care about and can just ignore actually a lot. This is not a worker state, but this is indeed an autonomous zone officially within Israel that Israel likes to claim for themselves, which is why I do not agree with a lot of their statements. Palestine is independent, and they have been independent for even a long time, despite of the illegal settlements that Israel has propagated within the West Bank. I also want to talk about the rise of Israeli propaganda within TikTok. If you don't know, IDF and actually various other organizations that support Israel have been actually infiltrating TikTok actually during this whole entire attack between Israel and Gaza, to where they actually promote a lot of Zionist propaganda in support of Palestine and talk a lot about apparently the Palestinian about the Palestinian terrorist groups, without actually realizing that these terrorist groups are not the majority of the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. It's actually even sickening. There is even women within these videos that are usually showing off their bodies and actually showing off a lot about themselves, waving the Israeli flag, and getting people turned on, while also having them ascribe to a literal police state as well. It's absolutely mortifying. It's sexist in of itself, even despite the fact of women freely choosing this, as well as the fact that this is absolutely a Zionist propaganda format in which it can rally international supporters to subscribe to the fascist ideology of Israel, and the fascist ideology of Zionism entirely. Now, for my last point, I want to actually go back to a lot of history, into historical arguments that Zionists would usually make. And an argument that Zionists would usually make is usually that Jews historically have been a prosecuted minority within other nations, especially in Nazi Germany with the Holocaust being committed. And when Israel was essentially instituted, it was created in 1948, right after World War II and right after the despair and the absolute problems that the aftermaths and the, in fact, actions of the Holocaust had produced for the Jewish community, to where, in their eyes, that the Jewish community essentially needed the Israeli state to be formed. There's a lot of problems with this argument. One, the Jews in Europe never usually either went to other countries and migrated to other countries, or stayed in Germany, or stayed in other countries that they lived in and migrated to other countries. And two, they usually migrated more either into the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, to where they would live off their lives in the Americas further. In fact, really only 2% of Holocaust victims that were Jewish origin had actually decided to go to Israel after it was formed by a British resolution in 1948. And even with these claims even being instituted, these did not justify the actions of ethnic cleansings, nor did the either directly or indirectly that Israel has committed into a Nakba, and I would claim an ongoing Nakba against Palestinians, to where just because a Holocaust was committed against your people does not mean that then those same people have to commit another Holocaust against another. It's pretty simple. Two wrongs do not make a right. The fact that this is even a real argument by Zionists is absolutely disingenuous, and shows they really don't even care about the humanity and the actual human rights of Palestinians, to where they can blame about the Holocaust and talk about the Holocaust in their crocodile tears, while meanwhile they commit another Holocaust that against Palestinians, referred to the Nakba, where Palestinians are usually killed and brutalized every single day within the Israeli state. Now, another claim that they make is usually that the Jews and the entire Jewish community has actually lived off the Emirate kingdoms within Palestine, and has indeed considered it a Jewish community for Jews and for a Jewish place. And it is true. These kingdoms did indeed exist. In fact, they were usually considered as three kingdoms of Palestine, where there were Jewish majority, and they would meet up within Jerusalem to pray and to gather up and to share biblical texts of Judaism. This is indeed true. However, after the migration of the Jewish community, the large scale of the Jewish community, where they migrated to Turkey, Greece, and then into Hungary, Bulgaria, and all the rest of Europe, as well as even migrated east to Iran, Arabia, and various other countries all around the world, a lot of these actually places and a lot of the kingdoms of the Emirates usually ended up going unoccupied and ended up being defunct later on due to precarious events that happened within these kingdoms, due to the actually failures and actually problems of theocracy within the kingdoms, to where the Jewish community essentially had expanded outward outside Palestine, and the Palestinian natives were actually able to breed with each other, and actually were able to create an entire new native group within Palestine that essentially had lived there for quite a long time, and have made their own kingdoms, made their own feudalist order, and have made their own history as well within these nations, disconnected away from the Jewish community as well. This is only really a problem with the Israeli state, or at least related to the Zionist question, when Sykes-Picot's agreement was essentially declared, and Palestine would belong into the British, against the actual actions and against the actual resolutions that the Palestinian people wanted. So yes, these kingdoms existed, and this is indeed a accurate claim. However, this does not then say that then this land belongs to you, due to the fact of the lack of occupation of Jewish people within this land, and actually more of occupation within natives. Not only that, but just because you essentially were able to live there for since the past, in the last 3,000 to 10,000 years ago, when those kingdoms existed, does not then mean that today you have to then create a Nakba against the people of Palestine. Anyways, that's all for today. These are my remarks on the current Palestinian situation. Right now in Israel, and the current Israeli and Gaza Strip is really in a ceasefire situation, and in fact earthquakes have even gathered up as well within Gaza in the aftermath of attacks that Israel has committed against the civilians within Gaza, to where countless civilians have even died despite the fact of the lack of attack and the ceasefire between Israel and Gaza. Not only that, but even when the ceasefire was declared within Gaza, journalists and activists are still indeed being arrested by the Israeli state, and are being fought against and are being brutalized within the West Bank that Israel claims as its own. This is all the more effort to where we have to support Palestine and the Palestinian people themselves and the national liberation movement within Palestine that are made up of workers themselves and are able to unite the working class internationally, which is exactly what they have been doing in order to help within a format where Palestine and the working class entirely of Palestine will indeed be free and will be liberated, to where the working class as well in Britain, France, the United States, Germany, and various other countries and states that support Israel, that have declared allegiance to Israel, will essentially gather up and will essentially unite in an effort to rebel against the Israeli state. Not only against the Israeli state, but the entire bourgeois system and the capitalist system entirely. The liberation of Palestine has to come with the entire liberation of humanity and the full abolition of capitalism for the establishment of socialism and communism. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. All these efforts would help grow this channel and grow these statements and grow these opinions even further, to where we can actually make an effort and collectively together to actually spreading class political consciousness and actually get people to learn a lot more about the current situations, due to the fact on how consequential and how needed the information on this factor and on these topics is very much needed. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. Socialist Links is out.